Did you ever wonder what actually happens in the morgue when everyone leaves and only the bodies remain? I've worked here for a long time, too many years to be honest. 10, maybe 12. I stopped counting. The smell of formaldehyde, it seems, has forever seeped into my skin, into my hair, even, I think, into my soul. People always ask what it's like to work among the dead, imagining something eerie, filled with ghosts and whispers from the darkness. In reality, it's not like that, at least not entirely. Most of the time it's routine, cold, silence, and bodies. So many bodies. But the real story begins afterwards, when the lights go out, and the only illumination comes from dim night lamps that seem to intensify the shadows. That's when that very waiting begins. I remember my first night. Young, naive, with a sense of smell not yet fully developed. I thought I'd be scared, that I'd hear footsteps, creaks, all those clichés from horror movies. But it was different. There was only the hum of the ventilation, the sound of water draining in the pipes, and something else. Something I couldn't identify then. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue, paranoia, but it didn't leave. It was a feeling of presence, not malicious, not frightening, but palpable, as if the air was filled with something that vibrated at a certain frequency, accessible only to me. Over the years I learned to ignore it, or at least I thought I did. I learned to move in that silence, to perform my work with methodical precision. Every body, every incision, every stitch, all of it became part of a monotonous but incredibly important ritual. We are here to give them their last dignity, to find answers for the living, but also to do something more, something very few people guess. Usually when I'm alone, I check all the refrigeration units. It's a kind of rounds, to make sure everything is in its place, that the equipment is working correctly, and, of course, it gives me a chance to make sure once again that I'm truly alone. In reality, I'm not alone. Never alone. And it's not about my sanity, if that's what you thought. It's connected to them, to those who remained. And if you ever thought that death is the end, let me tell you, you are wrong. It's only the beginning. And what begins is much more complex than you can imagine. I'm not talking about ghosts in sheets or chains. I'm talking about energy, sensations, echoes of what was, and sometimes, very rarely, about something that can even move. But not in the way you think, and it's in these moments as I walk through the rows of numbered drawers that I feel myself getting closer to something, to a solution. But the solution always slips away. For now. I remember an incident that forever changed my perception. It was several years ago. A young guy was brought in, a victim of a car accident. A common occurrence, unfortunately. Multiple injuries, incompatible with life. We performed the autopsy, all as usual. Late in the evening, when everyone had left, I was doing my usual rounds. Cold chambers, dim light. And that's when I approached his drawer. I heard it. It wasn't a sound in the usual sense of the word. Not a moan, not a whisper. It was more like a vibration. Something that was felt in the air, like a slight tremor. It emanated from where the guy's body lay. I froze. My heart pounded. My rational brain tried to find an explanation. A draft, equipment malfunction, playing shadows. But my intuition, the very one that had developed over years in this place, screamed the opposite at me. I slowly pulled out the drawer. The body lay motionless, covered by a sheet. No visible changes. But that vibration, it grew stronger. I extended my hand, not touching, just feeling the air above him. And then it happened. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sheet over the guy's chest lifted slightly, just by a millimeter, and then it fell. Then again, as if he was breathing. Can you imagine my shock? My 10-year experience screamed that it was impossible. The man was dead. All signs of death were present. But my eyes and my senses told me otherwise. I stood there, in complete silence, watching this barely perceptible movement, which repeated again and again. There were no convulsions, no muscle contractions, just this slight, rhythmic lifting of the sheet. It continued, it seemed, for a whole eternity. Minutes turned into hours. I was paralyzed by fear, but also by an inexplicable curiosity. Eventually it stopped, as suddenly as it began. The sheet stopped moving. The vibration disappeared. The room once again plunged into its familiar, ringing silence. I slowly pushed the drawer back in, feeling cold sweat trickle down my forehead. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing: I wasn't crazy. I saw it. And from then on, I began to look at my work differently. I began to notice other things, barely perceptible changes in temperature in certain places, a faint glow that sometimes appeared in the corners of the room when there were no other light sources. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers, but they were always too quiet, too indistinct for me to understand. I began to look for explanations, but science was silent. Religion offered its answers, but they didn't align with what I saw. This was something else, something that was beyond our understanding, and this something, it seemed, was most active precisely when we, the living, left, precisely when only the bodies remained. Ever since I started noticing these oddities, my job stopped being just a routine. Every night in the morgue turned into an observation. I began keeping a diary, recording every subtle change, a flickering light, a faint sound, an inexplicable movement. I felt like a researcher, immersed in an invisible world that coexisted with ours, but was separated by the thinnest veil. One time, it was in the dead of winter. The night was especially cold and quiet. The wind howled outside the window, and I was absolutely alone. That night an elderly woman was brought in. She had died of natural causes. A peaceful death, they said. Nothing unusual. But when I closed the door to her cold storage unit, I felt it. It was something new, not a vibration, not a glow. It was a sense of calm, a deep, soothing peace that permeated the air, and it emanated from her. I stood there by her drawer. I closed my eyes and just breathed in that feeling. It was so strong, so tangible, that it seemed as if you could touch it. It was like a presence that didn't want to leave, but rather remained. And there was nothing eerie about it. On the contrary, it was comforting. It made me think about death in a completely different way. Perhaps not everyone who remains here stays because of some unfinished business or trauma. Perhaps some remain simply because they want to, or because they can. The night passed, and this feeling didn't fade. It seemed to envelop me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt myself not just as a morgue worker, but as part of something bigger, part of a transition. I thought of all the bodies that had passed through my hands, thousands, each with its own story, its own life, its own unspoken secrets, and now I began to understand that these secrets don't die with them, they remain. In a sense, they continue to live here, in this cold, quiet place. I slowly ran my hand over the steel surface of her drawer, and at that moment, I felt a barely perceptible warmth. Not hot, but definitely not cold, like everything else around. It came from within. It was so subtle that I would have easily dismissed it as my imagination if it weren't for all my other experiences. I placed my palm on the metal, and the warmth grew a little stronger, as if there was an invisible connection between us, pulsating softly but surely. It was like a silent dialogue, and although I couldn't understand the words, I felt their meaning. Something holds them here. Not chains and not ghosts, as I said before, but something far more fundamental, something that we, the living, cannot directly see or hear. And every night when the lights go out and the doors close, I feel that this something grows stronger. It gains its power, and I, standing here alone, feel that I am getting closer to understanding. Perhaps too close, because what happens when only the bodies remain is not just silence, it is waiting. And sometimes it is a beginning. I began to notice that this waiting wasn't random. It followed certain patterns. It seemed to intensify during specific hours, especially between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. And even stranger, it was stronger with bodies that had died suddenly, or those whose deaths were linked to strong emotions, fear, anger, despair. It was as if the energy of these experiences remained trapped within them, and then, in the silence of the morgue, began to manifest. I started to experiment, not with the bodies, of course, that would be immoral and unprofessional, but with the atmosphere. I tried leaving certain objects near the refrigerators, old photographs, small personal belongings that relatives sometimes brought, but later didn't claim. Sometimes it worked. The sensations grew sharper, the vibrations stronger, as if these objects acted as catalysts, helping something to manifest. One night, after a particularly difficult day when we'd received several bodies from a major accident, I felt something new. It wasn't peace, it wasn't a vibration, it was cold. Not the physical cold of the room, but something else. A bone-chilling cold, but not due to temperature. It emanated from one of the drawers, which held a young woman. She'd been found several days after she disappeared. The story was dark, full of unclear circumstances. I slowly approached that drawer. The cold intensified, as if a small glacier had formed right there, inside the steel chamber. I didn't dare pull it out. Something inside me told me it might be dangerous. For the first time in all these years, I felt not just curiosity, but genuine apprehension. I felt that something in this body didn't want to be here, that it was resisting. I stepped back a few paces, watching. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen around that drawer. The air there felt denser, almost palpable. And then I heard it. A quiet, very quiet sound, like a barely discernible scratching. It was intermittent, but constant, as if someone was trying to get out. My heart pounded. I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might see. I thought about leaving, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the same thing that had drawn me in all these years, the unsolved mystery. I knew I had to understand. This was no longer just observation. It was immersion. I felt that the boundary between the world of the living and what lies beyond it was becoming thinner and thinner, and I was standing right on that boundary. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair, staring at that drawer, listening to the barely discernible scratching, which only stopped at dawn. When the first rays of sun appeared, the feeling of cold and the sounds vanished. Everything returned to its eerie but familiar silence. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was a warning, or perhaps an invitation, and I felt that I was getting closer to the answer, to what truly happens when only the bodies remain. And I had to be ready. I started noticing patterns. Some bodies, it seemed, lingered longer, not in the sense of physical presence, but in the sense of this unexplained echo. It didn't depend on the cause of death. Victims of violence, people who died in their sleep, even infants. There was no logical explanation why some left behind such a strong sensation, while others did not, but I was sure it wasn't a coincidence. I began to pay attention to details, to personal belongings brought with the bodies, if there were any, to the expressions on their faces, frozen in the moment of death. to how their hands were positioned, even to the slightest creases in their clothes, if they had any. I was looking for a key, something that could explain why some of them seemed to never fully leave. One night I was working on the body of an elderly man. He died at home, in his bed. Seemingly a usual case. But when I began my work, I felt a slight tingling in my fingers. You know, like when your hand falls asleep, but much more subtle and concentrated. It came from his hand as I moved it, and I felt that I needed to find something. I checked his pockets. Nothing. Examined his clothes. Ordinary worn clothing. But then, when I pulled at the collar of his shirt, I noticed something on a thread that seemed to be hanging on the inside. It was a very small, faded, but still recognizable pendant. A stone the size of a pinky fingernail, attached to a thin, almost invisible silver chain. It was hidden, as if someone wanted it to be found, but not immediately. When my fingers touched the pendant, the tingling intensified, spreading through my entire hand, moving up my forearm, and at that moment I felt a wave of emotions, not my own, someone else's, sadness, but also some deep, almost painful attachment. It was fleeting like a flash, but so real that I pulled my hand back. The pendant was still there, cold and expressionless, but I knew I had just touched something important. I didn't remove the pendant. I just left it there, hidden as it was. But this incident confirmed my theory. It's not just residual energy, it's something like a trace, an imprint of what was most important to the person. And this imprint remains, attracted to some anchors. These could be emotions, unfinished business, or, as in this case, an object that held deep personal meaning. Now, when I walk through the chambers at night, I'm not just checking equipment. I'm looking for these anchors. I feel them, and I wait. I wait for this invisible world to show me even more, because I'm convinced that these bodies, left in the silence of the morgue, aren't just lying there. They're waiting for something. And I'm here to bear witness, to perhaps understand, and maybe even to help them. Exactly what that is, I don't know yet. But I feel that the solution is near, and it will be far more astonishing than I can imagine. With each passing night, I felt this invisible veil thinning. My sensations grew sharper, and the echoes clearer. I began to discern not just emotions, but almost intentions. Some bodies, it seemed, were filled with a deep calm, others with a quiet sorrow. But there were also those from whom an unclear, unsettling energy emanated, as if they were searching for something, unable to find peace. One such incident occurred very recently. A young woman, about 25 years old, was found with no signs of violence, but with her face frozen in an expression of profound horror. The cause of death was never determined. She lay on the table, ready for autopsy, and such a disturbance emanated from her that I couldn't concentrate. It seemed the air around her trembled. I finished my work, but couldn't leave. I just stood nearby, feeling this wave of anxiety, and suddenly I heard it. No, not with my ears. I heard it in my head, as if it were a thought, but not my own. It was a single word, repeating, insistent, filled with despair. Key, key. My heart pounded. I looked around. Of course, no one was there. But the word sounded so clear, so distinct, that I was certain it wasn't a hallucination. It was a message, direct, from her. And then I remembered all my observations. Anchors, objects. I slowly, methodically checked her clothing. Nothing. Her hair, nothing. But then, my fingers touched her palm. It was clenched into a fist, and I felt something hard, small, beneath my fingers. I gently uncurled her cold fingers. Inside lay a tiny, old, engraved silver key. It was so small it barely fit on the pad of my finger. When I took it, the disturbance in the air instantly subsided. A feeling of relief emerged. I stood there holding this key and looked at her now serene face. What was this? A key to what? To a drawer? To a mystery? To some house or a box? I didn't know. And frankly, I still don't know. But I understood one thing: these bodies don't just lie here. They don't just wait for a final farewell or scientific research. They, in some sense, continue their existence, interacting with us, the living, on a level we are only beginning to comprehend. And now, as I complete my rounds in the night silence, I feel that this place isn't the end. It's more like a portal, a place where the line between what we call life and what we call death becomes incredibly thin. And it is in this thinness, in this absolute silence, when only the bodies remain, that the greatest secret lies. I cannot tell you what will happen next, but I know that this isn't the end. This is only the beginning, and I will be here to observe.